The hum of the airplane engines filled the cabin as the young boy settled into his plush first-class seat, his eyes wide with wonder. He had never been on a plane before, let alone in first class. His father, a hard-working man who had saved for months to make this trip special, had surprised him with the upgrade. The boy ran his small hands over the smooth leather armrests, marveling at the extra legroom and the fancy menu placed neatly on his tray table. He felt like a king. But his joy was short-lived. A flight attendant, her polished demeanor masking a sharp edge, approached him with a tight smile. "Excuse me, young man," she said, her voice clipped. "This seat isn't for you. You need to move to economy." The boy blinked, confused. "But my dad said this is our seat," he replied softly, his voice trembling. The attendant's smile didn't reach her eyes. "I'm sorry, but there must have been a mistake. First class is for other passengers. Come with me, please." Before the boy could protest, she gestured for him to stand. Other passengers glanced up from their books and tablets, some whispering to each other, others pretending not to notice. The boy's cheeks burned with embarrassment as he gathered his small backpack and followed the attendant down the aisle. As they reached the economy section, the boy's father emerged from the restroom. He froze when he saw his son being led away, his face pale and tear-streaked. "What's going on?" the father asked, his voice calm but firm. The flight attendant turned, her smile now strained. "There was a mix-up with the seating. Your son was in first class, but he doesn't belong there. I've moved him to his correct seat." The father's jaw tightened. He knelt down to his son's level, brushing away the boy's tears. "Did she say anything to you?" he asked gently. The boy nodded, his voice barely above a whisper. "She said first class isn't for me." The father stood slowly, his eyes locking onto the flight attendant's. "Is that so?" he asked, his tone icy. The attendant shifted uncomfortably. "It's just policy," she said, though her voice lacked conviction. The father took a deep breath, his mind racing. He had faced discrimination before, countless times, in fact, but he had always swallowed his pride, not wanting to make a scene. This time, however, it was different. This time, it was his son. "We'll discuss this later," he said, his voice low but steady. He took his son's hand and led him back to their seats in economy, his heart heavy with anger and frustration. As the plane taxied down the runway, the boy stared out the window, his earlier excitement replaced by a quiet sadness. His father, meanwhile, clenched his fists, his mind already working on a plan. He wouldn't let this slide. Not this time. The wheels of the plane lifted off the ground, but the weight of the incident lingered in the air, setting the stage for a battle that would soon capture the attention of millions. As the plane soared through the clouds, the father sat in silence, his son resting his head against the window, exhausted from the emotional ordeal. The hum of the engine seemed to fade into the background as the father's mind drifted back to his own childhood, a time filled with struggles he had vowed his son would never have to endure. He grew up in a small, run-down neighborhood where opportunities were scarce and dreams often died young. His parents worked multiple jobs just to put food on the table, and the weight of their sacrifices was something he carried with him every day. He remembered the sting of being turned away from stores because of the color of his skin, the whispers and sideways glances that made him feel like he didn't belong. One memory, in particular, stood out. He was about the same age as his son is now, standing in line at a local ice cream parlor with his mother. When it was their turn to order, the cashier looked past them and called on the next customer, a white family, as if they weren't even there. His mother had gently tugged his hand and led him away, her eyes filled with a quiet sadness. "Some people just don't see us," she had said. "But that doesn't mean we're not here." Those words had stayed with him, fueling his determination to rise above the prejudice and create a better life for himself and his future family. He worked tirelessly, taking on odd jobs as a teenager and eventually putting himself through college. It wasn't easy, there were countless nights when he wanted to give up, when the weight of the world felt too heavy to bear. But he kept going, driven by the belief that one day, his children would never have to feel the way he did that day in the ice cream parlor. And yet, here he was, decades later, watching his own son experience the same pain he had fought so hard to shield him from. The flight attendant's words echoed in his mind, "First class isn't for you." It wasn't just about a seat on a plane, it was about the message it sent, the idea that his son didn't deserve to be there simply because of who he was. The father clenched his fists, his heart aching with a mix of anger and sorrow. He thought about all the times he had let similar slights slide, choosing to keep his head down and move on. But this was different. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about his son, his bright, kind-hearted boy who deserved to feel valued and respected, no matter where he sat on a plane. As the flight continued, the father made a silent promise to himself. He wouldn't let this go. He would fight, not just for his son, but for every child who had ever been made to feel less than they were. He didn't know how yet, but he knew one thing for certain: this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. As the plane began its descent, the father's resolve hardened. He had spent the remainder of the flight quietly comforting his son, who had fallen into a restless sleep. The boy's face, still streaked with dried tears, was a painful reminder of the injustice that had taken place. The father knew he couldn't let this slide. He had to confront the flight attendant, not out of anger, but out of a need to demand accountability. When the seatbelt sign dinged off and passengers began gathering their belongings, the father gently shook his son awake. "Stay here for a moment," he said softly, handing him a small toy from his backpack. The boy nodded, still too shaken to speak. The father made his way to the front of the plane, his steps deliberate and calm. The flight attendant was standing near the cockpit, her back turned as she spoke to a colleague. When she noticed him approaching, her polite smile returned, though it didn't reach her eyes. "Can I help you, sir?" she asked, her tone professional but distant. The father took a deep breath, his voice steady but firm. "Yes, you can. I'd like an explanation for why my son was removed from first class." The attendant's smile faltered for a moment, before she regained her composure. "As I mentioned earlier, there was a mix-up with the seating. First class is reserved for certain passengers, and your son was mistakenly placed there. I simply corrected the error." The father's eyes narrowed. "Mistakenly placed there? I paid for those seats." "There was no mistake." The attendant hesitated, glancing at her colleague, who quickly excused herself. "Sir, I understand your frustration, but these decisions are made based on policy. I was just doing my job." "Your job," the father repeated, his voice rising slightly. "Your job is to ensure passengers are treated with respect, not to humiliate a child because of his race." A few passengers nearby paused, their attention drawn to the exchange. The attendant's cheeks flushed, and she lowered her voice. "Sir, I assure you, this has nothing to do with race. It's standard procedure." The father reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, opening the recording app. "Then you won't mind if I record this conversation? Let's clarify what standard procedure looks like." The attendant's eyes widened, and she took a step back. "That's not necessary," she said quickly. "I've already explained the situation." "No, you haven't," the father shot back. "You've given me excuses, not explanations. My son was treated unfairly, and I want to know why." By now, a small crowd had gathered, their murmurs growing louder. A man in a business suit spoke up. "I was sitting nearby. I saw what happened. That boy didn't do anything wrong." A woman added, "It didn't look like a mix-up to me. It looked like discrimination." The flight attendant's composure began to crack. "Please, everyone, this is a private matter. I'll have to ask you to return to your seats." But no one moved. The father stood his ground, his phone still recording. "This isn't just about me or my son. This is about how people are treated every day. If you can't give me a real explanation, then I'll take this to someone who can." The captain, who had been observing the situation from the cockpit doorway, stepped forward. "What's going on here?" he asked, his voice authoritative. The father turned to him, his expression calm but determined. Your flight attendant removed my son from first class, claiming it was a mix-up. But I paid for those seats, and my son was treated with disrespect. I'd like to know why. The captain glanced at the attendant, who avoided his gaze. Let's discuss this off the plane, he said, his tone conciliatory. We'll get to the bottom of it. The father nodded, but he wasn't done. This isn't over, he said, looking directly at the flight attendant. Actions have consequences. As the plane emptied, the father returned to his son, who was waiting anxiously in his seat. Are you okay, Dad? The boy asked, his voice small. The father knelt down, his eyes filled with determination. I'm fine, son. And I'm going to make sure this never happens to you, or anyone else, again. The father and son stepped off the plane, the tension of the confrontation still lingering in the air. As they made their way through the bustling airport, the father's mind raced. He knew the fight wasn't over, it had only just begun. What he didn't know was that the incident had already started to spread far beyond the confines of the airplane. Unbeknownst to him, a passenger seated nearby had recorded the entire confrontation on their phone. The video, raw and unfiltered, captured the flight attendant's dismissive tone, the father's calm but firm demands, and the murmurs of support from other passengers. By the time the father and son reached baggage claim, the video had already been uploaded to social media with a simple caption, "Flight attendant removes black boy from first class. This needs to be seen." Within hours, the video began to gain traction. It was shared by thousands, then tens of thousands, as people from all walks of life reacted with outrage and disbelief. Comments flooded in, many expressing solidarity with the father and son, while others shared their own stories of discrimination. Hashtags like #FirstClassInjustice and #JusticeForTheBoy began trending, and the video quickly caught the attention of major news outlets. By the next morning, the story was everywhere. News anchors discussed it on morning shows, radio hosts debated it on air, and social media was ablaze with opinions. The airline, caught off guard by the sudden backlash, issued a brief statement: "We are aware of the incident and are conducting an internal review. We take all customer concerns seriously and are committed to providing a respectful and inclusive experience for all passengers." But the public wasn't satisfied. The statement felt hollow, a corporate attempt to placate the masses without addressing the real issue. Meanwhile, the father's phone buzzed incessantly with calls and messages, some from reporters seeking interviews, others from strangers offering support. One message stood out. It was from a lawyer who had seen the video and wanted to help. "What happened to your son was unacceptable," the message read. "If you're willing to fight this, I'd like to represent you pro bono. Let's hold them accountable." The father read the message several times, his heart pounding. He had never been one to seek the spotlight, but he knew this was bigger than him. It was about his son, and it was about every person who had ever been made to feel less than they were. He replied to the lawyer, agreeing to meet. That evening, as he tucked his son into bed, the boy looked up at him with wide eyes. "Dad, are we in trouble?" he asked. The father's heart ached at the question. "No, son," he said gently. "We're not in trouble. But sometimes, when something wrong happens, we have to stand up and make it right. That's what we're doing." The boy nodded, though he didn't fully understand. "Will it be scary?" The father smiled, brushing a strand of hair from his son's forehead. "Maybe a little. But we'll do it together, okay?" As the boy drifted off to sleep, the father sat by his bedside, his mind racing. He thought about the video, the lawyer, and the storm of attention that was only growing stronger. He knew the road ahead would be difficult, but he also knew he couldn't back down. The next morning, he woke to a text from the lawyer. "The video has reached over 1 million views. The airline is feeling the pressure. Let's meet today and discuss our next steps." The father took a deep breath, his resolve hardening. This wasn't just about a seat on a plane anymore. It was about justice, accountability, and the kind of world he wanted his son to grow up in. And he was ready to fight for it. The airline's headquarters was in chaos, Executives scrambled to contain the fallout from the viral video, which had now been viewed millions of times across multiple platforms. The public outcry was deafening, with hashtags like #BoycottTheAirline and #FirstClassInjustice dominating social media. News outlets were running the story non-stop, and the airline's customer service lines were flooded with angry calls. In a hastily arranged press conference, the airline's CEO stepped up to the podium, flanked by a team of public relations advisors. The room was packed with reporters, their cameras flashing as the CEO began to speak. "We deeply regret the incident that occurred on one of our flights," he said, his tone carefully measured. "We are committed to providing a safe and inclusive environment for all our passengers, and we take this matter very seriously. An internal investigation is underway, and we will take appropriate action based on the findings." The statement was polished, but it did little to quell the public's anger. Critics pointed out that the airline had failed to apologize directly to the father and son, and many saw the response as a calculated attempt to protect the company's image rather than address the underlying issue. Meanwhile, the father was meeting with the lawyer who had reached out to him. Her name was Clara, a seasoned attorney known for taking on high-profile civil rights cases. She had reviewed the details of the incident and was confident they had a strong case. "This isn't just about compensation," Clara explained as they sat in her office. "This is about holding the airline accountable and forcing them to make real changes. We'll file a lawsuit alleging racial discrimination and emotional distress. But we'll also push for policy reforms, mandatory anti-bias training for staff, clear guidelines on passenger treatment, and a public apology to your son." The father listened intently, his mind racing. He had never been involved in anything like this before, but Clara's confidence gave him hope. "What about the flight attendant?" he asked. Clara leaned forward, her expression serious. "She'll be named in the lawsuit, but our focus is on the airline. They're the ones who allowed this culture of discrimination to exist. If we can force them to change, it'll have a much bigger impact." The father nodded, feeling a mix of determination and anxiety. He knew the road ahead would be long and difficult, but he also knew he couldn't back down. As the meeting wrapped up, Clara handed him a stack of documents to review. "We'll file the lawsuit tomorrow," she said. "Once it's public, the media attention will intensify. Are you ready for that?" The father thought about his son, about the pain in his eyes when he was removed from first class. "I'm ready," he said firmly. The next day, the lawsuit was filed, and the news spread like wildfire. Headlines blared, "Father sues airline after son removed from first class in alleged racial discrimination case." The story dominated the news cycle, with legal analysts dissecting the case and activists rallying behind the family. The airline, now facing mounting pressure, issued another statement: "We are aware of the lawsuit and are reviewing the claims. We remain committed to addressing this matter with the seriousness it deserves." But the public wasn't buying it. Protests erupted outside the airline's offices, with demonstrators holding signs that read "First Class for All" and "End Airline Racism." Celebrities and influencers joined the chorus, calling for accountability and change. For the father, the support was overwhelming. Strangers reached out to share their own stories of discrimination, and donations poured in to help cover legal fees. But amidst the chaos, he remained focused on one thing: his son. One evening, as they sat together at the kitchen table, the boy looked up at him. "Dad, are we going to win?" he asked. The father smiled, though his heart ached at the question. "We're not just fighting to win, son," he said. "We're fighting to make sure no one else has to go through what you did. And that's worth everything." The boy nodded, his young mind trying to process it all. "I'm proud of you, Dad," he said quietly. The father's eyes filled with tears, but he quickly wiped them away. "I'm proud of you too, son. You're stronger than you know." As they sat together, the weight of the battle ahead felt a little lighter. The father knew the fight was far from over, but he also knew he wasn't alone. The courtroom was packed on the first day of the trial. Reporters lined the walls, their cameras trained on the father and his lawyer as they entered. The airline's legal team, a group of sharply dressed attorneys, sat at the opposite table, their expressions unreadable. The atmosphere was tense, the weight of the case palpable. The father sat quietly, his son by his side. The boy, though young, had insisted on being there. "I want to see them say sorry," he had told his father. It was a simple request, but one that carried immense weight. The judge called the court to order, and the trial began. Clara, the father's lawyer, stood and addressed the room. "Your Honor, this case is about more than a seat on a plane. It's about dignity, respect, and the right to be treated equally, regardless of race. My client's son was humiliated and discriminated against simply because of the color of his skin. This is not an isolated incident, it's a symptom of a larger problem within the airline's culture." She presented evidence, the viral video, witness testimonies from passengers who had been on the flight, and internal documents from the airline that revealed a history of racial bias complaints. One by one, passengers took the stand, recounting what they had seen and heard. "It was heartbreaking," one woman said, her voice trembling. "That little boy didn't do anything wrong. He was just sitting there, enjoying his flight. And then he was treated like he didn't belong." The airline's lawyers fought back, arguing that the flight attendant's actions were an isolated mistake, not evidence of systemic discrimination. They called the attendant to the stand, hoping to shift the blame. "I was just following protocol," the attendant insisted, though her voice wavered under Clara's cross-examination. "I didn't mean to cause any harm." Clara didn't let up. "Protocol? Is it protocol to single out a child because of his race? Is it protocol to humiliate him in front of other passengers?" The attendant faltered, unable to provide a satisfactory answer. The most emotional moment came when the boy took the stand. Clara had prepared him carefully, knowing how difficult it would be. The boy, clutching a small toy for comfort, spoke softly but clearly. "I was really excited to sit in first class," he said. "But then the lady told me I had to move. She said it wasn't for me. I didn't understand why. I just felt sad." The room fell silent as the boy's words hung in the air. Even the judge seemed moved, her usually stern expression softening. The father, sitting in the front row, felt a lump in his throat. He had tried to shield his son from pain, but here they were, fighting a battle no child should ever have to face. As the trial progressed, the evidence against the airline mounted. Clara called expert witnesses who testified about the psychological impact of racial discrimination on children, while the airline's attempts to downplay the incident fell flat. Finally, after days of testimony, the trial came to a close. The judge announced that she would deliver her verdict in a week. As they left the courtroom, the father knelt down to his son's level. "You were so brave in there," he said, his voice filled with pride. The boy looked up at him. "Do you think we'll win, Dad?" The father smiled, though his heart was heavy. "No matter what happens, we've already won by standing up for what's right. You showed everyone how strong you are." The boy nodded, a small smile breaking through. "I just want them to say sorry." The father hugged him tightly, his eyes filling with tears. "Me too, son. Me too." The week leading up to the verdict felt like an eternity. The father tried to keep life as normal as possible for his son, but the weight of the trial hung over them like a storm cloud. Everywhere they went, people recognized them, some offering words of encouragement, others staring in silence. The media frenzy showed no signs of slowing, with headlines speculating on the possible outcome of the case. Finally, the day of the verdict arrived. The courtroom was even more crowded than before, with reporters and spectators packed into every available seat. The father and his son sat at the front, their hands clasped tightly together. Clara sat beside them, her expression calm but focused. The judge entered, and the room fell silent. She took her seat, her face unreadable as she began to speak. "This case has brought to light a deeply troubling incident, one that has resonated far beyond this courtroom," she said. "It is the duty of this court to ensure that justice is served, not only for the plaintiffs, but for society as a whole." she paused, her eyes scanning the room. After careful consideration of the evidence and testimony, I find in favor of the plaintiffs. The airline is found liable for racial discrimination and emotional distress. They are ordered to issue a public apology, implement mandatory anti-bias training for all staff, and pay damages to the plaintiffs. The room erupted in murmurs, but the judge wasn't finished. Additionally, the flight attendant involved in the incident is to be terminated immediately, and the airline must establish a clear policy to prevent such incidents from occurring in the future. The father felt a wave of emotions, relief, vindication, and a profound sense of gratitude. He turned to his son, who was looking up at him with wide eyes. "We won, Dad?" the boy asked. The father nodded, tears streaming down his face. "We won, son." Clara placed a hand on his shoulder, her own eyes glistening. "This is a victory, but it's also just the beginning. The real work starts now, making sure the airline follows through on these changes." As they left the courtroom, they were met with a swarm of reporters. Microphones were thrust in their faces, and cameras flashed relentlessly. The father held his son close, shielding him from the chaos. "How do you feel about the verdict?" one reporter shouted. The father took a deep breath, his voice steady, despite the emotion swirling inside him. "I feel relieved, but also hopeful. This isn't just about me or my son. It's about making sure no one else has to go through what we did. I hope this sends a message that discrimination has no place in our society." Another reporter asked, "What's next for you and your family?" The father looked down at his son, who was clinging to his hand. "We're going to take some time to heal. But we're also going to keep fighting, not just for us, but for everyone who's ever been treated unfairly because of who they are." As they made their way through the crowd, the father felt a sense of closure, but also a renewed sense of purpose. The verdict was a victory, but it was also a reminder of how much work still needed to be done. That evening, as they sat together at home, the boy looked up at his father. "Dad, does this mean I can sit in first class next time?" The father laughed, the sound warm and genuine. "You can sit wherever you want, son. But more importantly, you'll know that you deserve to be there." The boy smiled, his innocence a stark contrast to the heavy burden they had carried for so long. "I'm glad we stood up, Dad." The father pulled him into a hug, his heart full. "Me too, son. Me too." The weeks following the verdict were a whirlwind of activity. The airline, eager to repair its tarnished reputation, issued a public apology that was broadcast across major news networks. They announced sweeping changes, including mandatory anti-bias training for all employees and the establishment of a diversity and inclusion task force. The flight attendant involved in the incident was terminated, and the airline pledged to review its policies to ensure such an incident would never happen again. The father, meanwhile, found himself thrust into the spotlight. He was invited to speak at conferences, appear on talk shows, and participate in panel discussions about racial discrimination and social justice. Though he had never sought fame, he recognized the importance of using his platform to advocate for change. One of the most meaningful outcomes of the trial was the creation of the foundation he and Clara had discussed. Named First Class for All, the organization aimed to combat racial discrimination and support underprivileged children. The father poured his heart into the foundation, using the settlement money to fund scholarships, mentorship programs, and community initiatives. His son, inspired by his father's courage, became an advocate in his own right. At school, he shared his story with his classmates, teaching them about the importance of standing up for what's right. His teacher, moved by his bravery, organized a class project on equality and inclusion, which the boy proudly led. The father often reflected on how far they had come. What had started as a painful incident on a plane had blossomed into a movement, one that touched the lives of countless people. But amidst the busyness and the accolades, he made sure to prioritize his son. They spent weekends at the park, played board games, and talked about everything from school to superheroes. One evening, as they sat on the couch watching a movie, the boy turned to his father. "Dad, do you think things will really change?" The father paused, considering his answer. Change doesn't happen overnight, son. But every time someone stands up for what's right, it makes a difference. You've already made a difference. The boy smiled, his young face filled with hope. I want to keep helping people, Dad. Like you do. The father's heart swelled with pride. You already are, son. And I know you'll do even more as you grow up. As the days turned into weeks, the media attention began to wane, but the impact of their story continued to ripple outward. The father received letters from people across the country, sharing how his fight had inspired them to stand up against injustice in their own lives. Each letter was a reminder of why he had fought so hard, not just for his son, but for everyone who had ever felt unseen or unheard. One letter, in particular, stood out. It was from a young girl who had been bullied at school because of her race. She wrote, "Your story made me feel brave. I told my teacher what was happening, and now my school is working to make things better. Thank you for showing me that I matter." The father read the letter aloud to his son, his voice breaking with emotion. "This is why we did it," he said. "This is what it's all about." The boy nodded, his eyes shining. "I'm glad we helped her, Dad." As they sat together, the father felt a deep sense of fulfillment. The road had been long and difficult, but it had led them to a place of hope and healing. And though he knew there was still much work to be done, he also knew they had taken a significant step forward. Months had passed since the trial, and life had settled into a new rhythm for the father and his son. The foundation, First Class for All, was thriving, touching the lives of countless families and communities. The father had become a symbol of resilience and hope, but he never lost sight of what mattered most, his son and the lessons they had learned together. One crisp autumn afternoon, the father and son visited a park near their home. The boy ran ahead, laughing as he chased after falling leaves, while the father followed at a slower pace, his hands in his pockets. The park was quiet, the kind of peaceful that made it easy to reflect. As they sat on a bench, the boy turned to his father. "Dad, do you think people will remember what happened to us?" The father smiled, ruffling his son's hair. "I think they'll remember what we did about it. It's not about the bad things that happened to us, son. It's about how we respond." The boy nodded thoughtfully. "Like how you stood up for me?" "Exactly," the father said. "And how you stood up for yourself too. You showed everyone how brave you are." The boy beamed, his chest puffing with pride. "I want to keep being brave, Dad. For other kids who feel sad or left out." The father's heart swelled with emotion. "You will, son. And you'll inspire others to be brave too. That's how change happens, one person at a time." They sat in silence for a while, watching the leaves dance in the breeze. The father thought about everything they had been through, the pain, the fight, the victory. It hadn't been easy, but it had been worth it. "You know," the father said, breaking the silence, "this whole journey taught me something important." "What's that?" the boy asked, looking up at him. "It taught me that no matter how hard things get, we're never alone. There are always people who care, who will stand with us when we need them most. And it taught me that even the smallest voice can make a big difference." The boy tilted his head, thinking. "Like how I spoke up at school?" "Exactly," the father said, smiling. "Your voice matters, son. Never forget that." As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the park, the father felt a deep sense of peace. The fight had been long, but it had brought them closer together and shown them the power of standing up for what's right. "Come on," the father said, standing and holding out his hand. "Let's go home." The boy took his hand, swinging it as they walked. "Dad?" "Yeah, son? I'm really proud of you." The father stopped, his eyes filling with tears. He knelt down, pulling his son into a tight hug. "I'm proud of you too, son. More than you'll ever know." As they walked home, hand in hand, the father felt a renewed sense of purpose. The journey wasn't over, there would always be more battles to fight, more lessons to learn. But for now, he was content. They had faced adversity with courage, and in doing so, they had inspired others to do the same. And that, he realized, was the greatest victory of all.